Did you know that Africa is the second largest continent in the world after Asia, with an area of about 3 million square kilometers covering about 20.3% of the total landmass of the Earth? It is unbelievable that the length of this continent is about 8,000 kilometers from south to north, and its width from east to west is about 7,400 kilometers. With more than 1.3 billion people, Africa has 54 countries that house about 1/7 of the world's current population. The oldest inhabited area of the Earth with human species on the globe is in Africa. During the middle of the 20th century, anthropologists discovered fossils and evidence of human existence, possibly dating back 7 million years. Fossils remain of several species of very ape-like human, Neanderthals, that are thought to have evolved into modern humans. Theorists believe that since 130,000 BC, a group of African populations settled on the desert, which at that time was a fertile valley covered by numerous rivers. In 70,000 BC, Africa suffered the extinction of 30% of its wildlife species. According to this theory, in 30,000 BC, the world entered its last major glaciation period. As a result of this issue, terrible things happened in the world, including the Sahara Desert reached the highlands of Ethiopia. The mountain range of Central Africa were covered with ice sheets. The Nile River disappeared north of Khartoum. At the end of the Ice Age, around 10,500 years BC, the desert is thought to have returned to a fertile green valley, and African populations returned to it from the coastal and inland highlands of the sub-Saharan Africa. However, the warming and cooling of the climate meant that by 5000 BC, the Sahara region was becoming increasingly drier. The population migrated from the desert to the Nile Valley under the second waterfall, where they established permanent or semi-permanent settlements. A major climate reversal occurred, while reducing the amount of heavy and persistent rainfall in Central and Eastern Africa. Since then, dry conditions have prevailed in East Africa, especially Ethiopia, for the past 200 years. The division of Africa, or the struggle for Africa, or the competition for Africa is the name of the process that took place between 1881 and the First World War in 1914, and consisted of the invasion, occupation, colonization, and annexation of African land by European powers during the period of imperialism. In the last 25 years of the 19th century, the tension between the European countries over Africa became very high, and this government decided to divide the continent among themselves, fearing that a large-scale war would occur over Africa. It is believed that cattle were also domesticated in North Africa from 6000 BC. In the Sahara-Nile complex, people domesticated many animals, including the mule and small goats with twisted branches that were scattered from Algeria to the New Desert. In terms of agriculture, the first cases for growing plants for agricultural purposes in the Sahel region happened around 5,000 years BC in Africa, at the same time when African corn and rice began to grow in this region. According to the Oxford Atlas of World History, in 4,000 years BC, the climate of the desert began to become drier with a very rapid process. This climate change caused the loss of lakes and rivers, and thus increased the process of desertification in Africa. In turn, this reduced the amount of migration for settlement and helped the migration of agricultural communities to warmer climates in West Africa. Since 3000 BC, agriculture has existed independently in both tropical West Africa, where African sweet potatoes and oil dates were grown, and in Ethiopia, where coffee and tea plants were cultivated. Since the first millennium BC, blacksmithing has appeared in North Africa and rapidly begins to spread across the Sahara and into northern parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And from 500 BCM, metalworking began to separate in West Africa. Blacksmithing was fully developed in East and West Africa around 500 BC, but other regions did not develop it until the early 1st century AD. Some copper objects have been excavated in Egypt, North Africa, Nubia, and Ethiopia in West Africa dating back to 500 BC to 600 BC, suggesting that trade networks were established around this time. In 1482, the Portuguese established the first set of trading posts along the Ghanaian coast at Elmina. The main goods traded there were slaves, gold, ivory, and spices. In West Africa, the decline of the Atlantic slave trade in the 1820s and 1830s caused drastic economic change in the countries of the region. West Africa's greatest powers, the Asante Union, the Dahomey Territory, and the Oyo Empire used different methods to implement this change. Asante and Dahomey focused on expanding legal trade in the form of oil pulp, cocoa, timber, and gold to lay the foundation for the new export trade in West Africa. The Oyo Empire, unable to do so, fell apart in civil wars. In the post-medieval era, from the beginning of the Age of Exploration in the 15th century, the Portuguese Empire was the first European government to officially and seriously build settlements, permanent fortifications, and harbors on the shores of the ocean on all the coasts of the African continent. The explorations of the Europeans inside the African continent were only at the end of the 18th century, which were followed with great perseverance and seriousness. Before that, until 1835, explorers had mapped only the northern part of this continent. The best-known explorers of the mid-19th century were David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley, both of whom mapped much of southern and central Africa. So they mapped Africa. By the end of the 19th century, they were able to map the entire Nile River, from its source to its branches in the Niger, Congo, and Zambezi rivers, and they became aware of most of the natural resources of this continent. Until the 1870s, the Europeans controlled only 10% of the African continent, and their territory was limited to the coastal areas. Angola and Mozambique in the hands of the Portuguese, the Cape Colony in the hands of Britain, and Algeria, which fell in the hands of the French, were the most important parts of Africa that had become colonies. Until 1914, only Ethiopia and Liberia remained separate from Europe. Industrialization had increased the speed of transportation and communication, especially in shipping with steamships, railroads, and the telegraph. Advances in medical knowledge were also noteworthy because they helped treat tropical diseases. Advances in the treatment of quinine and finding an effective treatment for malaria allowed the Europeans to make extensive inroads into tropical Africa. In many countries, the military armed forces have been considered as the only group that have been able to effectively establish order and have ruled many African countries during the 1970s and 1980s. During this period, from the early 1960s to the late 1980s, Africa had more than 70 coups and 13 presidential assassinations. The story of Africa was like this. So to complete its more details, look at the second part of this video, which is expected in August, to understand all the dimensions of this documentary. Thanks for watching.